My name is Darcy Halverson. I am 73 years old, and I am sitting in my father's kitchen in Watson Lake, Yukon. And I am recording this on the same cassette device my father bought in 1982 to keep notes on road conditions between here and Whitehorse, because it still works, and because I cannot think of a more fitting instrument for what I am about to say. My father, Gunnar Halvorsen, died on the 14th of March this year. He was 89 years old. He drove the Alaska Highway for the last time in the fall of 2009, when he was 75. And he drove it alone, as he had driven it alone every October since 1961. And when he came home that last time, he sat down at this same table, and he said to me, in a voice that was not sentimental and was not frightened, that he thought it was finished. He did not say it was finished because he was too old. He said it was finished because the one who walked with him had not come to the truck that year. And he believed that was a message he was meant to receive without argument. I did not ask him what he meant by the one who walked with him. I had known what he meant since I was 11 years old. I am telling you this now because my father is in the ground, and because he left a letter in the third drawer of this kitchen table, addressed to me, and in that letter he wrote one sentence that released me from 48 years of silence. The sentence was, "Tell the road what it carried," and so I am telling it. My father came to Watson Lake from Stavanger, Norway, in the summer of 1955. He was 21 years old, and he had a trade certificate in diesel mechanics and a cardboard suitcase, and approximately $40 Canadian, and he spoke English with an accent that never fully left him, even after 60 years in the North. He had read about the Alaska Highway in a Norwegian geographical magazine, and he had decided, with the particular determination of a young man who has never been told the world will not cooperate with him, that he wanted to see it. He arrived in Watson Lake by bus from Whitehorse, stood in the road outside the bus depot for approximately 10 minutes, and walked into the garage of a man named Clifford Nolt, who ran the only diesel service between Watson Lake and the Yukon River crossing, and asked him in accented but precise English whether there was work. Clifford Nolt looked at his trade certificate and looked at his hands and told him there was a cot in the back room and supper at 6. That was how it began. Clifford Nolt was 54 years old at the time, a widower, originally from Fort Providence in the Northwest Territories, a man of large hands and few words who could diagnose an engine problem by the sound of it idling at the end of a cold night. He had run the garage for 11 years. He had a daughter named Sylvie, who was 17 and lived with an aunt in Whitehorse during the school year, and came home in summers. Clifford spoke of Sylvie the way he spoke of the garage, which is to say, with a kind of careful respect, as though she were a piece of equipment he trusted completely and would not risk to weather he had not measured. He did not speak of Sylvie's mother except once, in the spring of 1957, when he told my father that she had gone into the bush in the winter of 1949 and had not come back, and that the search had found nothing, and that he had formed certain beliefs about what had happened that he did not expect anyone else to share. And he said this in a voice so flat and so final that my father understood he was not being told the story. He was being told the border of the story, and that beyond that border, the country was Clifford's alone. My father married Sylvie Nolt in June of 1959. She was 21. He was 25. and it was the longest conversation my father had ever had with a woman, by which he meant it was the only conversation he had had with a woman that he did not want to end. Sylvie was small and precise, and she read everything she could find, and she had a habit of going still when she was thinking, completely still, in a way that my father said reminded him of the water at the surface of a very deep lake. They were married in the yard behind the garage. Clifford cooked the meal himself. There were 14 people present, all of whom worked either the road or the timber. This is who they were. Clifford Nault, the father of the bride, a man named Hector Beaulieu, who drove freight, a woman named Paulette Lepage, who cooked at the camp 12 kilometers north, Paulette's husband Fernand, who worked the timber, 3 men whose names I was not told, and whom my father remembered only as the brothers from Teslin, a mechanic named Walt Swanson, Walt's wife Dorothy, 2 indigenous women from the Casca community, whose names were Rosalie and Adele, and who had known Sylvie since she was small, a boy of about 12, whose name I never learned, and who sat apart from everyone and ate quietly and left before the cake, and my father and mother. That is 14. My father could account for every one of them. He told me the list when I was 7. To teach me, he said, that the most important things in a life have witnesses, and that the witnesses should be named. I was born in April of 1961 in the back bedroom of the house behind the garage. Clifford Nault was present at the birth because there was no one else, and because he had assisted at enough difficult calving to understand what was needed. He said afterward, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of strong tea, that everything was as it should be. He said this without elaboration. I weighed 6 pounds and 14 ounces. My father recorded it in the garage logbook, between a note about the replacement of a fuel pump on a Kenworth and an entry about weather conditions on the north section of the highway. He could not explain why he wrote it there, except that it was the book he had in his hand, and he did not want to wait. The first fall after I was born, in October of 1961, my father drove the highway north. This was a thing he did for the garage, an annual inspection run to check the road condition before the worst of the freeze, to note the places that would need attention before spring, to carry a few parts to the camp at mile 212 where a fuel depot needed servicing. He had done it the 2 previous falls as well, driving alone because Clifford stayed with the garage and because Sylvie, that first year, stayed with me. He left on the 7th of October, and he expected to return in 4 days. He returned in 3, and when he came through the door of the kitchen, he stood for a moment, looking at my mother in a way that she recognized immediately as the look of a man who had something to say that he was not certain he could say. She put me down in the basket by the stove, and she sat across from him at the table. And she said, in a voice my father described as completely level, without any performance of calm in it, but genuinely calm, as though she had been waiting for this particular conversation for some time. Tell me what you saw on the road. My father told her. He had been at approximately mile 170, which is a stretch of the highway that runs along the edge of a spruce forest, so dense and so dark that even in afternoon light the trees red as a single wall, and the road there is narrow, and the shoulder drops sharply to a creek bed on the east side. It was late afternoon, the sun already low and the light the colour of old brass, and he was driving slowly because the road surface there was soft in places, and he was watching for the signs of it. He said, the truck simply stopped, not mechanically, not by his hand, but in the way a horse will stop at something in the road that the rider has not yet seen. And he sat for a moment, not understanding. And then he looked to his left, through the driver's window, into the trees. He said it was standing approximately 30 feet from the truck, at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still. He said, still in the way he would say it, of a standing stone or a photograph, not the stillness of an animal that has frozen in inattention, but the stillness of something that does not need to conceal itself, that is simply present. It was very large. He said it was taller than the truck cab. He said its fur was the dark brown of wet spruce bark in October, and that it had the quality of something that had grown from the land rather than arrived on it. He said he could not see its eyes clearly in that light, only that they were set deep, and that they were directed at him, not at the truck, at him specifically, with what he could only describe as recognition. He sat in the truck for what he estimated was 4 minutes, though he said time moved strangely during those minutes, and he could not be certain. He said he did not feel afraid. He said fear did not enter it in any way, which was the thing that surprised him most, because he was a man who had felt fear before and knew what it was, and this was entirely different from it. He said it was more like the feeling of being acknowledged by something that had been watching you for a long time and had decided, finally, to let you know it was there. Then it turned and walked into the trees, and in 3 steps it was gone, and there was nothing in the space between the trees to indicate anything had ever been there. And he sat in the truck for another few minutes, and then he drove home. My mother listened to all of this. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "My mother walked into the bush in 49 and never came back. I have believed for 12 years that there was a reason she was not afraid to go. I believe now that I was right." That was the first conversation my parents had about the one who walked with my father on the highway. There would be many more, but that was the first. And my father always said that the most important thing about it was that my mother had not doubted him for a single moment, not because she was inclined to believe unusual things, but because she had been carrying her own version of this knowledge since she was 8 years old, and she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to hand her the piece that completed it. He said the look on her face when he finished his account was not surprise, and was not relief, and was not grief, but something for which he did not have a word in either Norwegian or English. Something close to recognition, the way your face changes. When you hear a name you have always somehow known, spoken aloud for the first time. I was not told about any of this until I was 11. What I knew before that, what I observed before that, was the annual departure each October, the particular quality of my father's silence when he returned, and the long conversations at the kitchen table between my father and my mother and my grandfather Clifford, in which I was present but not addressed, and which I understood instinctively to be about something serious and private, that I would be permitted to know when I was old enough to carry it. I was not a child who pushed against this. I had been raised by 3 people for whom silence was not withholding but a form of respect, and I had absorbed from all 3 of them the understanding that certain things have their own proper time. The telling, when it came, happened in November of 1972. I was 11. I was home from school with a head cold, and my grandfather Clifford sat in the chair across from me in the front room with a cup of tea, and he told me about the highway and about what had, walked alongside my father's truck on 16 of the 17 October runs my father had made since 1961. He told me what my father had seen. He told me what my mother had understood it to mean with respect to her own mother. And then he told me something he had never told my parents, which was that on the night of the 5th of January, 1949, the night before Sylvie's mother walked into the bush, she had sat with Clifford at this same table and told him that she had been meeting someone on the South Trail for the better part of 2 years, someone she could not explain and would not ask him to accept without the same evidence she had, and that she had decided to go and live where she was welcome, and that she was not afraid, and that she was sorry for the pain it would cause, but that she was not sorry for what she had found. She had asked him to raise Sylvie and to never tell her the truth until Sylvie was old enough to understand that her mother had not been lost. She had gone willingly. She had gone home. I sat with this for a long time. My grandfather sat with me. He was a man of 67 at that point, still large and deliberate in his movements, and he sat in the chair across from the sofa with his hands on his knees. And he looked out the window at the spruce along the back edge of the yard, which in November were dark against a grey sky, and he did not speak for several minutes, and I did not speak either, because I had absorbed from him, more than from anyone else, the understanding that silence in the presence of large things is not avoidance, but courtesy. When he finally did speak again, he told me a few more things. He told me that in the spring, after Sylvie's mother left, the year the snow finally cleared from the South Trail, he had walked that trail to the point where her tracks ended and found, in the soft ground at the edge of a small creek, prints that were not hers and were not any animal he knew. He had stood looking at them for a long time. He had not told anyone at the time, not the searchers who had already given up and gone home, not the constable in Watson Lake, who had written in his report that the woman had likely fallen through the ice and been carried downstream. He had stood at the edge of that creek, and he had looked at the prints, and he had decided that what he understood was sufficient, and that no additional reporting would serve any purpose that mattered. He had said goodbye to his wife in that moment, and he had also, he said something like hello to whatever had walked with her to that creek, because it seemed the right thing to do. He was not certain it could hear him. He was not certain it was still there, but it seemed right to acknowledge it, and he did. He said he had never regretted that. He said it was the most important thing he had ever done, that no one else witnessed. I have thought about that creek for 60 years. I do not know where it is. My grandfather never told me, and I never asked. Some locations are meant to stay unvisited. We drank our tea, he said. When the cups were empty, I do not know what they are. I have thought about that for more than 20 years, and I have reached the limit of what I can know. What I know is that your grandmother was not a confused woman, and was not a frightened woman, and was not a woman who made choices without understanding them. What I know is that your father drives the highway every October and comes back changed in some way that is not damage, but is something else, something more like repair. What I know is that the world has more in it than I was taught, and that the parts of it I was not taught may be the more important parts. He said this without grief and without ceremony. Then he took the cups to the sink and rinsed them, and that was the end of it. I have thought about that conversation for more than 60 years. I have thought about it in the way you think about a room you were shown once, and then the door was closed, not because it was sealed to you, but because you understood that you could enter it only by earning your way there, by accumulating the years and the losses and the specific quality of attention that would allow you to see it clearly. I have lived in Watson Lake my whole life. I married a man named Peter Halvorsen, a distant cousin of my father's, who came up from Alberta in 1986 and stayed because the North agreed with him in some deep way he could not articulate. Peter drove the highway with my father twice, in the late 90s, and both times he came back with the same quality of silence my father always came back with. And when I asked him what he had seen, he said, "I saw what your father has always seen, and I understand now why he never tried very hard to describe it." He and my father sat at this table the evening of the second return, and they did not speak much. They drank whiskey, and they played a game of cribbage, and at some point Peter said, in a voice that was not dramatic, "I believe it recognizes the truck." And my father said, "I believe it recognized the truck before it recognized me." And they both found this quietly funny and left it there. Peter died in 2014. He is the reason I am speaking now, in addition to my father's letter, because Peter made me promise before he died that I would say out loud what I had always known, and he said it with an urgency that I found at the time slightly surprising from a man who was not by nature urgent about anything. He said, "Darcy, someone ought to say the thing, while there is still someone left who was there." I told him I would. I am a woman who keeps her word. I want to say more about Peter because it would be incomplete not to. He was a man from Alberta who had grown up on a grain farm outside Lethbridge and had come north originally to work a pipeline contract and had stayed, as people sometimes stay in the north, because the scale of the country spoke to something in him that the South had not. He was not imaginative in the literary sense. He was not a man who read novels or talked about his feelings in the way people increasingly talked about their feelings in the years after he arrived. He was exact and practical, and he trusted what he could observe, which is why his account of the 2 drives he took with my father on the highway matters more to me in some ways than my father's own account, because my father had 48 years of accumulated context, and Peter had none. Peter saw what he saw with no prior expectation, no framework, no inherited story to shape the seeing. He drove to mile 170 in October of 1998 with my father in the passenger seat, because my father's eyesight had begun to be unreliable at dusk, and my father had asked him to come, and Peter had said yes without asking why, because that was the kind of man he was. He came back and he sat at this table and he said, "There is something on that road that is not afraid of us." He said it exactly that way. Not threatening, not wonderful, not strange, simply not afraid. He said, that was the most accurate thing he could say, and that he did not want to say more than was accurate. That was Peter. He drove the highway once more with my father in 2001, and this time when he came back he said only, "Same." I asked him, years later, whether he had thought about it in the intervening time, and he said, "Every October." He said this without weight, without drama, as a simple calendrical fact. My father drove the highway every October from 1961 to 2009. That is 48 years, with the exception of 1968, when he had a surgery on his left knee in late September and could not drive until December, and of 1979, when the truck blew a head gasket at mile 91 and he was towed back to Watson Lake and did not, attempt the run a second time that season. He drove it alone. My mother offered to come once in '63, and my father declined without unkindness, saying only that he did not believe it was meant for two. She did not argue with this. She had her own relationship with what she understood, and she had drawn her own perimeter around it, with the same precision she applied to everything else. I asked my father once, I was in my 30s, what it was like to drive that stretch of road in October, knowing something might be waiting. He considered the question for a long time, which was his habit with any question he took seriously. Then he said, "It is not like waiting for something. It is more like coming to a place where something is possible, and staying open to the possibility, and not being disappointed when the possibility does not occur, and not being surprised when it does." He said, "I do not go expecting. I go available." I have thought about that word for 30 years. Available. It is the right word for what he did. He was not a man who pursued the thing on the road. He was a man who made himself available to it, year after year, in the same truck on the same stretch of highway, in the same October light, because he had decided early on that whatever it was, it deserved his consistency. He kept a logbook. Not the garage logbook, a separate one, a composition notebook that he bought at the hardware store in Watson Lake and kept in the glove compartment of the truck. He made entries after each run, dates and weather and road conditions, and, in plain, unembellished language, what he had seen. I have the logbook. I am holding it now. It has 41 entries. In 29 of those entries, there is a note about what he calls the companion. The notes are brief and factual. October 7th, 1963. Companion present at mile 170, 30 minutes. Place something on the road ahead of the truck, a pine branch, heavy with cones, green as if cut from a height. Waited, I stopped and looked at it. It had gone back into the trees by the time I got out. I carried the branch home. Your mother put it in a jar. October 14th, 1966. Companion present at mile 170 as usual, but also at mile 203, which has not happened before. Did not approach the truck at 203, only stood at the tree line and watched me pass. I drove slowly. I did not stop. I do not know what the second appearance signified. No one knows. Those last 3 words appear in the logbook 12 times. No one knows. It is the most honest thing I have ever read. There were years when my father came back from the highway with objects. The pine branch. A river stone, dark grey, almost perfectly round, approximately the size of a fist, placed on the hood of the truck, while my father slept at the rest, stop at mile 190. Because my father was not certain how else it could have gotten there. A piece of birch bark folded twice into a shape that my father described as deliberate, not accidental, not the casual folding of a leaf in water, but folded the way you fold a piece of paper when you want it to keep its shape. He kept all of them. They are on the shelf in the front room, the stone and the birch bark and the dried cone from the pine branch, which my mother kept in the jar until she died, and which my father transferred to the shelf the week after her funeral. I have not moved them. My mother died in the fall of 1997. She had been ill for 2 years, and she died in October, which my father always considered significant in a way he could not explain and did not try to. He still drove the highway that year, 3 weeks after the funeral. I thought at the time that this was grief, that he needed the road the way some men need motion, and I said nothing. When he came back, he was quieter than I had ever seen him, quieter even than the year of my mother's diagnosis. And he sat at the table for a long time before he spoke, and what he said was, "It was different this year." I asked how. He said, "It came to the truck, not to the side of the road. It came to the side of the truck, directly beside the door, and it stood there for a long time, and then it put its hand against the window. The flat of its hand," he said, "against the glass. And he had not moved. He had sat very still, and he had put his own hand up against the glass from the inside. And they had stayed that way for what he believed was several minutes. He said the glass was very cold. He said it did not seem cold to the one on the other side. He said, when it finally moved away, it made a sound he had not heard before, low and sustained, and not a language, but not unlike a language. And he had sat in the truck for a long time afterward, and he had cried, which was the only time in his adult life he could recall crying. And he believed the sound was the reason, but he could not say why, and he did not intend to speculate. That was the one time in all our conversations that he told me something and then said he did not intend to speculate, as if he wanted me to know that there was a boundary here that even he could not cross, even after 36 years of driving the road, even with his grief open and his hand on the other side of the glass. I have thought about that moment, his hand and the one outside the glass, for 27 years. I do not know what it was. My grandfather said he had reached the limit of what he could know. I have reached that same limit and I am comfortable there. What I know is that my father was not a man given to invention. He was a man given to precision, to measurement, to the recording of what could be recorded, and the honest acknowledgement of what could not. He was a diesel mechanic from Stavanger who came to a road in the Yukon in 1955 and found something there that he could not explain and did not leave. He stayed for 60 years. He drove the road for 48 of them. He kept the logbook. He carried the stone home. He put his hand against the glass. The last entry in the logbook is dated October 3rd, 2009. It reads, "Mile 170. Did not come. Waited 2 hours. Road very quiet. Drove to mile 212. Serviced the depot. Drove back. Stopped again at 170 on the return. Still nothing. The birches along the creek had gone yellow. Very beautiful. I think it is finished, and I think that is right. I am 75 years old. There is a limit to how long a man can make himself available, and perhaps there is a limit to how long the thing on the other side of the window needs him to." I drove home in good weather. Roads clear all the way. He never drove the highway again after that. He did not seem diminished by it. He worked in the garage for 4 more years, until Walt Swanson's son took it over, and then he sat in this kitchen, and he read, and he listened to the radio, and he talked to me about the road, the way old men talk about the years of their greatest usefulness, with affection and without mourning. He taught me the names of every tree in the boreal corridor from Watson Lake to the Yukon River crossing. He knew the spruce and the tamarack and the trembling aspen and the lodgepole pine and the white birch. And he knew the creek names and the place where the road dropped to the valley floor and the place where it climbed back out. And he described them to me with a specificity that was not nostalgic but archival, as though he were transferring a set of coordinates he did not want lost. He kept the logbook in the 3rd drawer with his letter to me. He drank his coffee at 6 in the morning and his whiskey at 8 in the evening. And he sat on the porch in October, no matter how cold it was, facing north, in the direction of the highway, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, and the old dog we had then, a grey-muzzled shepherd named Bjorn, sat beside his boot without being asked, and the two of them were still in the same way that my father had always described the thing at the tree line as still. And I did not ask him what he was thinking, because I knew what he was thinking, and it was his to think in private. He died on a Tuesday. He had been fading for 3 weeks, not painfully, simply receding, and I was with him at the end. The last thing he said to me clearly was, "The road knows everything that crossed it." He said this in a voice that was not valedictory, not theatrical, simply informational, the voice of a man making a final note in a logbook. Then he slept, and in the early morning he was gone. I have 3 children. My oldest is a daughter named Sigrid, who is 48 and lives in Whitehorse, and who has known the story since she was 14. My middle child is a son named Clifford, who is 45 and lives in Fort Nelson, and who has known it since he was 12. My youngest is a daughter named Marta, who is 42 and lives in Watson Lake, 2 streets from this kitchen, and who asked me, when she was 9 years old, whether her grandfather's truck had a ghost, because the truck sat in the garage, and her grandfather sometimes sat in the truck for long periods, doing nothing that she could see. I told her then that it did not have a ghost, and that her grandfather was resting. I owe her a better answer than that. She is coming for supper on Thursday, and I will give it to her. The logbook I will keep. The stone, the birch bark, the pine cone I will keep. I will drive the highway in October. Not to look for anything. Not because I expect to be available in the way my father was available, with his 48 years of consistency, and his diesel mechanic's patience, and his hand on the cold glass at mile 170. But because the road carried something for a very long time, and I believe the road should know that the carrying is remembered. My father drove it alone, as he always said, except for the years when he did not drive it alone, which was most of them. He was accompanied, on a road in the Yukon, in October, by something he could not explain and loved in the way you love a thing that has chosen to walk beside you when it had no obligation to, when it could have stayed in the forest, and you would never have known the difference. He drove it for 48 years. He kept the logbook. He brought the stone home. He told my mother, and she had already known, in the way she had always known, in the way her own mother had known before her, that the world has a second half that the first half does not teach you, and that the only way to find it is to be on the road, alone in October, in the low brass light of late afternoon, with your hands steady on the wheel and your eyes on the tree line, and nothing in you that is closed. I will turn off the recorder now. I do not have a final summary to offer. My grandfather said he had reached the limit of what he could know, and I have reached the same limit. And the limit is not a loss. It is where the country begins that belongs to someone else. I have described the border of it as faithfully as I can. What lies beyond it is not mine to say. The road runs north, and eventually it ends at the water, and the water is very old and very cold, and it has no record of anything, and that too is the correct ending for things that were never meant to be proved. I will leave the recorder on the table. I will leave the stone and the birch bark and the pine cone on the shelf. I will leave the logbook in the 3rd drawer. Someone will find all of it in time. The road knows what crossed it. I have done what my father asked.